technologies that we're using right now to get our job done, are these still the best technologies? What I was seeing was that the service provision was so different. These weren't providing the sort of service that I knew I had provided. I felt like small businesses needed someone that they could go to, somewhere that wouldn't cut corners, wouldn't try and fleece them at every opportunity.
Well, hello and welcome to the Architecture Beyond podcast. Today we are going to talk about a great and interesting subject that's relevant to architecture and technology. It's with the subject of IT, with the founder of Comstasis in Nashville and several other sites, and the CEO is with us today, CEO Jay Morgan of Comstasis. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here, Brandon.
To start off, I'm very interested about someone who's motivated about IT, who's doing something interesting. Can you talk a little bit about how you got started with IT Phil and how you got sort of your client base that includes architects?
I've always loved computers. It's funny when I hire prospective employees and interview people, most candidates will say that. I've always loved computers. They grew up on smartphones, they grew up playing Xbox. I grew up in the 80s, in the days of the Atari 2600 and MS-DOS, before Windows was released. So there were no touch screens or cell phones. You did everything on your computer at the command line. There were a few graphical games you could play, but if you wanted to play one, you really had to work for it. You had to edit text files and configure the startup environment. It was a different time. But even then, what we could do was very exciting. I could enter a command and then the computer would spit something out, and it was just amazing to me. And so I ended up getting recruited by the technology teacher at my high school to work as an intern and help support the computers in the network. He was busy teaching classes. He didn't have time to run all over the place during the day. So I got to substitute for him, which was a great crash course for me, and my passion just grew from there. And actually, interesting, one of the things that I was really interested in was CAD. I took a class at my high school, actually went to a state competition where I placed second, was super excited about that. I'd already learned basic drafting, but computer-aided design was really something else then. It lets you unleash your imagination, because if you could think of it, then you could design it. And if you could design it, then you could watch it take form right in front of you. So getting into CAD a little bit, and really with computers now doing a lot of the heavy lifting, I think it's really freeing designers to dream in ways that wouldn't have been possible just a few decades ago. If I hadn't loved writing software so much and loved the networking aspects of IT, honestly, that's something I could have easily gone into as a career, because I think it's a really interesting field, and the creativity of it, it's really cool.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot actually, because IT architecture is also a major. It's a industry, but there's some parallels, and that's definitely what some of our technology has come to.
For
Well,
sure. Yeah.
how did you go from that initial interest into turn into a firm and a business?
Well, when I started Comstasis, there were a couple of things that served as the catalyst for me. I've been working in technology at that point more than 2 decades. I'd worked for multiple external consulting firms, as well as I'd worked internally as a network admin, IT director, et cetera. And what I was seeing was that the service provision was so different. External firms and MSPs weren't providing the sort of service that I knew I had provided when I was the internal IT director, running the IT department. They didn't do things the same way. They didn't do it to the same level. And so I felt like small businesses needed someone that they could go to, somewhere that wouldn't cut corners, wouldn't try and fleece them at every opportunity. And second, I saw there was a huge divide in technology, that a lot of people that weren't the right sex or weren't the right color weren't getting the same opportunities. And that was also something that I wanted to step in and kind of help do something about that. So, so I saw an opportunity to make positive change in different ways and just jumped into it. As far as design firms specifically,
Mhm.
and meeting design needs, I felt like some of the technologies that I can imagine and that I wish we had more available, they're just not common enough yet. And so, there are solutions out there now that are coming of age slowly, like VDI, that's GPU accelerated. things
Mhm.
like that. But they still don't scale necessarily very well for small firms in all cases, or they're just not mature enough, or they're cost prohibitive, and there's still a lot of issues. But I think that the future will continue to see an abstraction of that design process from the hardware that's actually crunching the numbers. And so I'm looking forward to seeing that continue to evolve and that technology continue to mature.
The architecture industry. So I guess you've grown up and developed at the same time we've developed into a, from essentially, if you could say, the lifetime of the 1970s, where people are using all hand drafting, and a lot of companies, maybe they were like even typing using typewriters. I have my parents' typewriters. To now, like every company is an IT. Yeah, the big companies will have someone who is focused and dedicated onto their needs if they're working on big projects. Even the technology, now we're all in the cloud. You're saying that you evolved, a firm idea that wasn't just like this big corporate one that's separate, but you have a interest in sort of what some firms have done internally. But at the same time, a smaller firm definitely, like, they can't start with such a big, strong IT department. Like, I guess, could you speak to that? What do firms really have when they have that internal department that smaller firms
Yeah.
just don't have? Like,
For sure. Yeah, there's a huge difference in what larger companies are able to do. They're able to leverage IT resources just in a very different way. Scale makes a huge difference in technology, and in a lot of things, really. But uh, yeah, so when you have an IT department, you may have people, if you have a real IT department, like with several different members on the team, you might have people who are specialists in different solutions and can get really deep on those solutions. At the same time, you've got people who have broad knowledge and expertise and are able to handle a lot of different things, really everything that the company needs. And then you have um, systems that you can set up that can handle, dozens to hundreds, sometimes thousands of users in some of the organizations that I've worked at, which means that you have a little bit more money that you can spend in setting up that infrastructure. You can really do things right. And you can spend money on technologies that, if you're a small company with just a few people, it's really hard to spend the money on just the core technology needed to get you something that a bigger company would have. And so that scale can make a really big difference, both the scale in terms of personnel in the IT department and the knowledge that they can bring to the table, as well as the scale in some of the systems that those larger enterprises run. That when you're a large enterprise and you're buying this $100,000 piece of equipment or a system that you're setting up, you get to spread that cost out over a few thousand employees, and it's not that big of a deal. Where as if you're a five-man crew and you're spending $100,000 on the system, that's a little bit different.
that's true. It's something that people have to be humble about if someone is starting a firm, to say, we're not, just buying software and not matching like the management of it or the technology. The one firm owner, he was like, I'm IT, and it's like, he's not really IT. No.
Yeah.
Um, it was very interesting. There's a sort of quirky guy who did IT for us, but at the same time, without him, like, I know it would be like a bind, because as like the technology that people can enable by even just having one, IT person, which, is still limiting, versus having like what you have at Comstasis. You've developed a team that can provide that full service experience. Can you share something about the pivotal moment that you realize the potential IT to transform, um, versus just doing a service like you can go beyond? When did that occur?
I think really it's just come through supporting guys who are working in this field, because like I said, my last time really doing any kind of computer aided drafting and design was a long time ago. And it was, much more basic software running on much more basic systems. And so seeing what guys are able to do now, it's been eye-opening. Getting to support firms like Culture, Architecture, and Design that are relatively small in terms of headcount, but are actually getting to do some amazing things and work on some really large projects. Things that would have just taken massive teams to crank out the amount of work that they're accomplishing at the quality that they're accomplishing it just a few years ago. So it's been amazing to see and get to work with you guys that are in the thick of things in the field and be able to support you, and then see some of the challenges that you're running into, and try to help work, as a team, and come up with, solutions for those challenges.
Yeah, and just for the audience, I've talked about sort of I work with Culture, Architecture and Design. It's a Nashville-based firm, a little bit of a startup, but it's able to do like industry-leading work because for sure our IT systems with Comstasis, but just some of those ideas that come through an IT provider that the firm is really just able to provide. It's not just like like a lot of people maybe think I have a laptop, I can run architecture firm, but the idea is it's like it's much more advanced than that in ideas. With the right ideas, a firm will be supported and they can use that to grow and also just even handle bigger projects. A form of scaling that the IT part for architecture can do. It's interesting the entrepreneurial journey because it sort of hits back to what a lot of architecture firms are trying to do with coming up with new ideas. Uh, what was one of the significant obstacles that you overcame with sort of the Comstasis and sort of that idea of bringing that internal department to firms?
I think that really the biggest obstacle when I started Comstasis was probably just getting over my own ideas about what was possible. Thinking that starting a company was something that other people did. I think that was literally the greatest obstacle, that and the fear of just stepping out into the unknown. When you start a company, you're taking your livelihood into your hands. And so if you aren't supremely confident, then you probably won't last and won't stick it out because it is hard. Um, and honestly, I guess the stats say that most small businesses don't last. Most of them fail. So from a strictly rational point of view, I guess you have to be a little bit reckless to take that chance. But yeah, just getting over the idea that it might be too big to do, and just putting that trust and confidence in the skills that I had developed over, a few decades, and just getting out there.
Um, what so I this interview today is definitely interviewing or or both a little entertaining, but also educating architects about what really goes into IT to really because of the idea is definitely this podcast definitely is talking to people maybe who have a firm, but also people who are in a firm. I'm very interested in some of the advice you can give to sort of both like the internal of a firm, like some rules of thumb. What would you advise now to people who are just getting in, um, both at the top level or maybe just and then I guess we'll start with that and then we'll go to maybe an employee, someone who wants to be at a firm and be effective. What would be some like rules of thumb that you would give? Um,
hmm so for somebody that's thinking about starting a firm, think about how to do it in a scalable way. Think about, implementing technologies like cloud technologies that will scale well, that can start small and can grow with you. Um, Things that make it really easy to share and communicate, and where maybe you don't have to be all in the same room or in the same city in order to be able to communicate effectively, to be able to share data easily and effectively. And yeah, so thinking about scalability when you're starting a firm for sure is an important one.
what would be the mistakes that people make, common mistakes, maybe to watch out for?
So things like, I would say, well, on the security side, everybody seems to underestimate the importance of good security. And so, like, it would be a mistake really to not think when you start a firm, and for instance, when you start onboarding people, to not think about data security and things like that. Um, you want to own your data. You don't want your data to leave at the end of an engagement. So setting up systems that facilitate that. Securing your technology in general. You don't want a laptop to get stolen out of a car, but it does happen. And if it happens, you don't want to have to worry about not only now replacing the cost of that laptop, but whatever data that laptop had on it. What did it have on it? Whether it was properly secured. So having somebody who's fluent in those things, I guess, on hand to help set the environment up in a secure way is something that can be very helpful to you in different ways.
That security is a pretty crucial topic. nowadays. I know definitely several IT security leaders, and I've definitely seen it. It's in two ways. Like it's both the security of the data, because like Tennessee experienced like some hurricanes, and several firms like their offices were wrecked, and they lost access. What I guess on that side of just protecting the equipment, what do you recommend, like to sort of maybe foresee? Do you just say keep a server room that's in the basement? What would be like a critical way of sort of protecting the device itself?
Yeah, as somebody who came up in IT, securing enterprise environments, we always like to have a copy of things in another geographical location where
Okay.
possible. So, so yeah, you're right. There's different ways to look at security. So you have to secure data against being taken when it shouldn't, but you also have to secure data against being lost when you might need to retain it. And so yeah, we try and think about both of those with our clients, making sure that we have. So, for instance, with data these days, it's not that expensive to sync data to the cloud and to keep a backup, depending on how much data you have. And design is something that can generate a lot of data in some rather large files sometimes. But making sure that you have a copy of that in the cloud, in some of the larger environments that I've worked at, we've used co-location facilities so that data would be kept off-site, and then also used technologies like Microsoft Azure to be able to keep copies of data in Microsoft's data centers. And so thinking about it, it really just depends on the scale of your environment, how big you are, and what your specific needs are in terms of how geographically dispersed you are, things like that. Which technology is going to be best for you. But yeah, thinking about ways to make sure that if data is lost locally, you don't completely lose your data because that's your business.
Okay. So do you set up, like, would you, I guess, because I've seen firms with like a server closet where someone could actually spill coffee on it, versus firms actually that have everything in the cloud. Do you have like a preference? Which would you recommend like someone to start with?
Well, again, I think that it does vary depending on the needs of the environment. It depends on cost needs. It depends on whether to an extent, do you want to spend money as a capital expenditure, or do you want the operational expenditure of putting that data in the cloud and then paying somebody, basically to rent server space, which is what you're doing. Um, so yeah, there's different factors that can impact that. Um, if you need GPU acceleration, like we see a lot in design, then that can impact that decision. So um, I'm bullish on the cloud. I feel like we're going to move there more and more. I think that we've moved to cloud platforms first, things like Office 365 and Google Workspace, things like that. But and I started moving things to cloud infrastructure many years ago, over a decade ago, was moving things to the cloud uh, from an infrastructure standpoint, servers and things like that. And I think that that shift is going to continue also. It, again, it really depends on the needs of the environment, but yeah, that's just going to keep on going.
Another big issue, especially because now uh, firms we're loving to do a lot more video or animation, which is definitely gonna more than triple or uh, quadruple, even 10x the size of our storage. What are some advice you will give on that storage issue? Like what should firms be looking for um, to really set themselves up
Yeah.
for
So make sure
success?
you're not just storing everything on an external hard drive. I think that's the main thing.
Okay.
Because that external hard drive is only going to last so long. It has a finite lifespan. There's a mean time between failure, they call it MT, BF, rating, a number for devices like that, for storage devices. And eventually it's going to fail. It's just a matter of when, not if. And so, make sure you do have a copy of that data somewhere. And so if you are using a NAS, there are some NAS devices that will enable you to automatically keep a copy in, for instance, AWS. You can store it in such a way that it's relatively inexpensive to keep a copy there and just automatically uh, upload everything. Of course, that requires having throughput, and so having an internet connection that can support the amount of data that you might be transferring, just depending on how much data you're creating and how big your team is. But yeah, so if you are going to keep things in cases like that, a lot of times it really does. You do need to have the data local and on site because you're working with it. You're working with that data live. And sometimes, depending on what your latency is, how good of a fiber connection you have, if you have a fiber connection, all these different things, it sometimes isn't going to be practical to try and work with the data if it's not on site. And so that's where, having a nice NAS or something can be helpful, or a server infrastructure or something. But then making sure that it is backed up somewhere else, and there are various technologies that can help you to back that up, whether it's to Azure or AWS or somewhere like that.
So the storage conversation has pretty much switched to cloud and temporary storage, like maybe in the hard drive itself, because like hard drives are pretty much sort of the worst option now, is what it seems like you're saying.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in terms of reliability, because when you put your data in, take Azure for an example, um, even if you're not doing anything to back up the data, Microsoft is keeping multiple copies of that data so that if some disaster does strike Microsoft, you don't lose all your data. If their server crashes, your data is still safe somewhere else. And so you don't have to necessarily make multiple copies of that data, that cold data that you're not accessing hot and live right now. But yeah, so your hot data you're going to want to have on some sort of physical device, most likely, but then the warm data or cold data can start to go up into the cloud, into cloud storage, where maybe you can pull it
Mhm.
down if you need a file or some files, have that in warm data, and then eventually when it's stuff that you're not really going to be accessing anytime in the near future, but you don't want to get rid of it because yeah, you might still need it at some time 6 months from now, then you can move that into a less expensive tier of storage, like Glacier in the AWS world, where it's less expensive to maintain.
Um, Moving on to one of the issues that is on the other side of that storage, what we want, what architects see, because we're so visual. Um, the display world, it is sort of advanced, but it's still at the same time, we're still limited to either a laptop screen or a wider screen. What is your recommendation in terms of, okay, because some architects are thinking maybe we want to do a big wide screen, some want to do several smaller screen. What is your recommendation like on that side?
Well, from that standpoint, I'd say you're probably asking the wrong guy. I would ask the
Okay,
designer what their preference is
okay,
because,
okay,
yeah, and
okay.
I would provide what's going to work with their workflow. I like having, multiple small screens because I like working in multiple windows, and I think that multiple screens facilitates that really well. But
Mhm.
I can see where somebody could also do that on a big, large screen. You just can't snap the same
What
way.
is the difference between like what you just customized? Because it seems like, again, like we had like a Christmas list, or shopping list for what we want in our machines, because we're architects in some sense. Some reason we always get gaming machines because we want to be like clicking and sort of having everything move on space. What is your advice for sort of that balance, because we have to also be very productive,
Hmm.
so.
Well, I think that the gaming machines are actually a pretty good option for you guys. Those are important just from the standpoint that what you're doing is working with a lot of 3D modeling and things, a lot of rendering, and those are things that really require a GPU to do them quickly and well. Um, GPUs and CPUs are just fundamentally different in how they do their computing,
Okay.
and how they do their calculations. And so, for the type of function that you guys use a computer for on a regular basis, that GPU is a critical function. That's the same thing that enables gamers to have really good graphics when they're playing their video games. And so, it ends up being a good technology for you. Even if we're going to look at using VDI instead of a physical device, I still think that it's important to have some sort of GPU accelerated VDI, and so that you can still have that performance when you're doing your rendering, and so things don't take 10 hours to render when you could render it in one. Um, so yeah.
I've done like several sort of reviews of computers from maybe the architecture side, just looking at features. But what would you say are maybe the top three that would work for maybe an architecture firm who's using the standard, maybe Revit, rendering? Which brands are the best for that?
I know that we use a lot of Lenovo machines, their gaming laptops, and so it also depends on whether you're looking for a laptop or a desktop. You're always going to get the best bang for your buck in performance out of a desktop computer, but there are some laptops that hold their own reasonably well and have GPUs in them. Um, so yeah, there aren't any specific models. I'm definitely not a gamer, and honestly, that's a question that's probably even better for one of the techs that works at
Sure.
Comstasis, because some of those guys do
Yeah.
play a lot of games, and they know exactly what GPU model that they want to have right at any given time. Uh,
Celebrating 1 year of insightful conversations, you're tuned into Architecture Beyond. This emerging podcast sheds light on life beyond architecture, featuring monthly guests from different backgrounds in and around the architecture world, creating impact beyond the studio. Today's show is featuring IT leader and Comstasis founder Jay Morgan, as he sheds light for professionals about the right mix of technology for a great design workflow. This show is brought to you by Iamthestudio, a great resource for architects and designers to learn the best design software skills. Visit iamthestudio.com to learn more.
What do you see as the complete list of services? Because the idea is it's not just setting it up and maybe something went wrong, that's why we
yeah,
see it. Yeah, but there's a complete
yeah,
setup that actually would be keeping you afloat.
for sure, yeah. And I
Yeah.
would just say that the question is probably bigger than
Mhm.
most people would think when they ask that question. And so because we do things in an environment that the business owner themselves, if they're not an IT professional, which unless they have an IT business, they're probably not, that they're not even thinking about, right? So we had recently a client that we were just onboarding that they couldn't email they couldn't send emails to some of their clients as we're onboarding them. This was one of the first tickets that we got, was that they couldn't send email to certain clients. And it was because when the environment had been set up, everything was, all of the basic stuff had been done, but there's some additional stuff that we just do automatically by default when we're set up in an environment, but it's extra level of stuff that you have to manually go in and do, but that hadn't been done in this case. And so they were literally not able to email certain email addresses because this extra thing hadn't been put into place in their email infrastructure. And so there's really, you need, when you're using technology, leveraging technology the way that that is done in the design space, especially where it's such a critical part of your business and being able to function and output work. um, you need obviously the things that are obvious, like somebody to set up a laptop and put a user account on a laptop and install software on it. But you also need to make sure that the drive is encrypted, right? Somebody who's looking at things like that. Make sure that you've got something in place to synchronize data so that your data is being backed up in the cloud. Make sure that you've got somebody handling email and making sure that your cloud storage is properly secured, that your email is properly secured. Make sure you have antivirus on the machine, which is still kind of a basic thing, but not something that everybody just thinks about and does. So there are, and then, so you have the lower level things like um, device administration, email administration, storage administration, things like that, cloud service administration. But then you have things like being a partner, a thought partner, and trying to envision, like what technologies are actually the technologies that we're using right now to get our job done. Are these still the best technologies? Or, a year or 2 years have gone by since we started using these technologies. Are there new technologies that are better that we should be thinking about? We should be looking forward and looking around and seeing how the landscape is changing and looking at new technologies that are emerging, like AI, and be thinking about, well, how can AI assist us? Is that something that's going to kind of become something that enhances the design process, where it takes some more of the load off of the designer? So yeah, just being a thought partner, I think, and as well as basic things like helping you to do your budgeting and think about,
Yeah.
how many employees you're going to have now, and then how many employees you're going to have in 5 years, and what is it going to cost you to get from here to there, and what technologies are you going to need in order to bridge that gap.
Okay, that's really helpful, for sure, because definitely someone could just be like not understanding those other steps that are needed. So seeing that and then yeah, finishing with a thought partner. That's the where that consultant, someone who will understand, is gonna help. That's a great list. I'll go back to the computer situation because I know since Lenovo is one that I'm using now and I've used that for a few years, but I do want to think about okay, so architects will use I think Dell, Lenovo are some of the key ones we use. Um, would you consider is that would that be accurate? Like, because there's also some lesser expensive brands that you could buy. I'm not gonna
Yeah.
put down HP, but there's also some other like brands. Would you think if someone would say like a very powerful computer, like definitely the laptops, that's not like a brand like Dell or Lenovo, would that be a bad risk for the power that they say?
So I think that there's a little bit more temptation probably to look at some, I would call them second tier brands when when you do need that level of horsepower in order to work efficiently. Um, because for just a basic general purpose laptop for business use, they're not that expensive and there's a wide variety and it's pretty easy to get a Lenovo or a Dell or an HP or something that's really good. But when you start looking at the kind of horsepower and the GPUs and things that we're looking for and the amount of disk space, the options from some of the bigger players start to become pretty pricey. And then you start looking around and you do see that there are some other brands out here that maybe aren't quite as well known, but they're offering looks like the same thing. They're offering this nice GPU and this nice processor, and it's much less expensive. So I'm not afraid of those necessarily. A computer is a computer, but I think that there's something to be said for, and honestly, I've had bad experiences with the major players as
Okay.
well, right? Like I've had bad experiences with lots of different kinds of computer brands over the years. So, but look at the support, look at the warranty that comes with it. And I mean, if the price is right, it might make sense to take a chance. I would say if you're going to have a fleet of lower end computers or second tier computers, then maybe have an extra one just in case. But yeah, no, they could work just fine.
I think a lot of students will make the choice for just the price for something that's, or even because they could just, like I've seen some of those machines that will render, etc. Um, I- but at the same time, for a firm has to be a little more conservative. So, like you said, like if they're gonna take a risk, make sure to have the extra one. Um,
Yeah.
I was
And I
looking,
think also it's
yeah,
maybe not as big of a deal with desktop
sure.
computers, where custom computers are pretty prevalent. Maybe a little bit harder to find a good lower end machine in the world of laptops. So it kind of depends on what you're looking for also, where the fit and finish tends to be a little bit more important and how well the thing's put together is a little bit harder to do at a smaller scale, like some of these smaller manufacturers would produce.
Um, I, a lot of architects love the iPhone and iPad. But is Apple like a is would that be a serious thing to have if you're not really going to use more the Apple side in the day-to-day work? Because I know I work at firms and everyone had iPhone, but no one was working on Apple. Though it's a probably
Yeah.
top tier.
Yeah. So the issue with Apple becomes software compatibility. There's not a lot of, and so it depends on how you're working. There's not a lot of software that I know of for design that's written for Apple. There's some nice multimedia software, I guess, for Apple devices. Um, Probably not even as much as there is for PCs, but there is some. But as far as for drafting and design, not so much. If you're using VDI and a VDI infrastructure, so virtual desktops, so that your computing isn't actually being done on the physical device that you're holding in your hands, the device is being done somewhere in the cloud or on a server in your data center, then the device you're using doesn't really matter. You could use a Mac, you could use a PC. At that point, it's just a keyboard and a screen, really. Um, but if you're actually doing the computing and the crunching and the rendering on the physical device that you're using, then I haven't seen really where Apple's producing, where the software compatibility is there to make apples compelling.
It's just not their focus in terms of as they do like great computers for like people having fun and media producers, but in terms of architecture, or that type of work, the software providers will determine if that can be used. Um,
Yeah, I think the price point hasn't really made sense.
mhm,
Either the amount of power that was needed really wasn't available
mhm,
on Apple's platforms, or the cost was just so high to get the power. Although I will say that with Apple's move recently to ARM architecture over the last few years, and them coming out with the M1 and then M2 and now the M3, the processing power is really starting to be a lot more um, impressive coming from Apple. And yeah, I wouldn't be super surprised if people started porting more design type software over there at some point because the capability is there now.
if a firm is hiring like they maybe if they are working with and then if they're like growing and they need like in-house IT, do you also consult or what would you advise? Because if someone was setting up a team, like I think after a certain size, like I was talking to one from this, like I was talking to one provider, it's like they will need like full-time IT. I guess what is your thought for when a firm would cross that threshold? Um,
Yeah. We've actually got, we support firms at all different
yeah.
sizes. So we work with companies that are as small as one or two
Mhm.
employees, actually, all the way up to companies that are over 100 employees. And so we do support companies that really essentially need a full-time person. And I guess one of the advantages that they get of working with us instead of hiring, and in fact, we support companies that have had a full-time person and now are using us
So that
instead.
it's
And
not even you wouldn't say it's like required. It's it's
it's definitely not required.
okay.
It can still make sense to use a firm like ours just because the depth and the breadth of experience and expertise that we can offer to them is usually much more than they're going to be able to get from a single individual, and certainly from a single individual at the kind of price point that we can meet when it comes to providing that technology management service.
Okay. So that's a good point because it's definitely I think it can scale for such a large size if you have the right strategies
Yeah.
and management.
Yeah, and especially the ability that we have to grow and shrink with the needs of the organization. So when the organization, when everything is really set up and configured correctly, uh, the workload should be relatively light most of the time.
Mhm.
It's really when things aren't set up well that there's always a lot of work to do. But when things are set up well, then it should be relatively light. But then there always come times when there's turnover, you're deploying new products, new software, new hardware, and you just have a much higher need for support. And it's really hard if you're using an internal person for them to scale up like
Yeah,
that because they've only got so many hours in their work
sure,
week. Whereas we can just throw two or three people at an issue for a week or
sure,
two during times like that. And so
sure.
it can be helpful in that way as well.
Um, in terms of so more now on the new hire or the team member, what is your recommendation to help get new hires or new people to a team efficient as fa or because they all need to have their IT set up, um, but they also what is the guidance to get them there? So if you go from 0 to 100 um,
Yeah.
with IT,
So I
yeah.
think it's,
Hmm.
yeah. So I think it's uh, effective onboarding and efficient onboarding processes are really important. There's nothing more frustrating than being hired to do a job and not be able to do it because your technology is not working. And so um, there's not a lot of like issues that we run into usually doing onboarding just because we've got a process that we follow. We know we have checklists that we go through, and we've got lists of here's all of the software that this client uses, here's all of the way that we normally configure their hardware, here are the cloud systems that we're going to set up for each new person that we onboard. Here's the security that we're going to have to maybe walk through with the person, help them set up multi-factor authentication and all these different things. And so because we've just kind of got it dialed in, it's usually not that big of a deal when we do have to onboard a new person because we've got systems that facilitate that from a general setup to a security standpoint.
Um, in terms of actual, like maybe some of the software companies like AutoCAD or Adobe, what are some of your directions sort of in maximizing? What are some mistakes to avoid with like, if someone says, okay, wow, let's do Revit, let's do their BIM, let's, what are some things you can go before if someone is either transitioning or scaling up with those service providers?
So one of the things that I would say is make sure to the extent possible, make sure you're leveraging group or team or organization, however they call it. Different vendors will call it different things, but make sure you're leveraging an account that is geared towards business and towards operating as a team, because those will usually have features that you're not going to get. Because one of the things that people will do sometimes is they'll just buy a bunch of individual licenses for whatever that software is, whether it's Adobe or Microsoft or something else. And then they don't necessarily work well together. They don't necessarily integrate well and share well together. Also, they're just a lot harder to manage, 5 different independent licenses or 50 than it is to manage one team account where you maybe have 50 different users in it. And so thinking about, again, scalability from the very beginning when we're setting up an environment, we're thinking about scalability. And it might be that, okay, it's very easy. We've only got 1 or 2 users in this brand new firm that's starting up, and it's not going to be a big headache to manage 2 different individual accounts, but we're still thinking about the fact that, well, it's 2 people now, but hopefully in 5 years it's going to be 20 people, and then it will be an issue if we don't have things set up correctly now.
Yeah, that's a good point. Um, it's 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 like you help manage the, I guess, procurement of the technology. You don't just wait. It's used. If someone has a firm, they should come to you before thinking of a new software.
Really, we do. We're
Yeah,
like the IT department for for all of the clients that we support,
yeah.
in that we are providing support from fixing a broken device
Hmm.
all the way up to acting like the VCIO and helping you decide what devices to purchase. And
Yeah,
then even for many of our clients, we even facilitate the procurement. We actually go out and buy the hardware, buy the software, buy the licensing, whatever it is, and just provide it.
yeah. That's an awesome service. You guys are, replacing that and doing it very efficiently. That's a great way of doing that. How important is it for keeping a culture of continuous learning and adaptation of IT with a team? How important is it to make sure that they're, not just working on assumptions?
Oh, it's super important. I think for anybody going into the design or the IT fields today, um, adaptability, the ability to learn, that's really like the most critical skill. Being able to think critically and analyze and synthesize. We live in the information age, and information is changing faster than ever. The way that we're doing things is changing faster than ever. So fundamentals are important. Absolutely, it's important to have fundamentals. And there's, fundamentals I learned 30 years ago in my IT career that I still make use of today. But just know that any higher order skills that you accumulate are quickly going to get outdated. They're quickly going to get stale. So be prepared to keep learning. And if you're going to go into the design field, then technology is going to be a big part of that. So be prepared to keep learning about technology as well and how to implement it. Not only how to implement it effectively in the work that you're doing, but how to implement it safely and securely.
That's important, and like you do that both. Like you'll come in house to, like, I see, like, definitely with the Comstasis team, like you guys coming and you'll educate every time. So like it's like if there's a major shift, you ask the questions and prepare, like, either the management or like whoever needs to tell the team to get that done. So I think that's a great investment. Um, I guess, now looking to the future, what sort of emerging technologies are you seeing that you think are going to be affecting firms and industries like the design industry in the coming decade that people need to watch out for with IT?
Yeah, so First of all, just the wide prevalence of GPUs becoming so powerful and affordable. I think that that's already kind of changed things a lot. And then the cloud, the cloud has been slower, I think, to have an impact on this field than on some other fields, just because so much local power was required. But now we do have, GPU accelerated VDI technologies, virtual desktop technologies, and cloud-based even VDI technologies that are slowly getting more mature. And so I think that that's something that's going to remove some limitations, and remove some barriers to entry. I am also keeping an eye on things like artificial intelligence and thinking about how it even could impact this field. I think that that's something that we're going to see as that continues to evolve. So, so yeah, a lot of interesting technologies right now that I'm eager to see where they go.
What are some technologies we should be a little more maybe careful with that are coming up, tread softly? Because I heard about AI. AI could be like a double-edged sword, some of it's
Yeah. Oh, I am. While I'm excited to see what happens, I'm the biggest critic of of AI because yeah, it is a little bit scary. I think that it's something, AI is, and I don't want to sound like one of those guys, but I think it's kind of like nuclear technology in that it has a great potential to revolutionize and enhance life for humans, but it also has a great potential to be enormously destructive. And so, and destructive in ways that we might not even be thinking of right away. Like when you think of AI and destructive, probably the first thing that comes to mind is like Terminator scenario or something like that, where the AI rises up and kills its maker, which is a real threat. Like that's something that could actually happen. I think that that's a greater threat than some people probably realize. Um, but it's even in maybe less obvious ways that we should be concerned. So, for instance, the way that AI is taught, AI is a lot like a human in that you raise AI kind of like you raise a child, and you teach it how to think. You have to teach it how to learn. And so, what we see with children a lot of times is that they inherit a lot of the biases of their parents, and so you can kind of you can see a lot of times a mom and dad in a young person that's being raised up. And we're seeing that same issue with AI in that the data that you feed them to teach them and to help them to get more powerful is actually causing them to think in certain ways and to categorize in certain ways, which can be an issue, something that we have to watch out for, those biases.
That's important. And it's illustrative, but it's still a risk. So technology, be tread wisely with that.
Hmm.
Well, I guess thanks so much for the interview. Where can people find out more about Comstasis and maybe some ideas and direction on working with IT?
Yeah, please check us out. We're on the web at comstasis.com, comstasis.com, on LinkedIn. Feel free to follow there. And yeah, we'll continue to put out new technologies and new solutions for our clients. And look forward to seeing what you guys are doing on your side and in the design field.
That's awesome. Well, thank you, Jay. Again, I'm sure the audience enjoyed sort of learning about that IT part that we think we know, but at the same time we don't know. So definitely thanks again for all the audience for watching. Make sure to check the links in the bio. You can find out more about Comstasis and maybe some ideas for improving your IT game, or if you want to connect with them. Thanks for joining us. This again is Brandon Gibbs, host of Architecture Beyond. I'll see you in the next episode.
If you're interested in learning more about the newest design software and techniques, visit our sponsor Iamthestudio at iamthestudio.com and sign up with our newsletter Design Insights Weekly.
On the next episode of Architecture Beyond, we find out the recipe for innovation and design with Judy Curie, the accomplished PhD in architecture, MIT innovator, and founder of FabLab Poland. Be sure to check it out. This has been Brandon and the Architecture Beyond crew. Catch you in the next episode.